Welcome to class. Today we're going to be talking about lipids, which is the second of the 4 organic molecules we're going to be covering in the second half of Unit 2. So what I'd like you to do just to get yourself warmed up to the lesson is to come up with some ideas that you might have about where you see lipids in your everyday life. Another word for lipids is fats. So think about where you might come upon a fat source in your everyday life. Food, for example. There's still one big idea for this half of the unit. It's where we're going to talk about using evidence to explain how carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, as well as a few other ones, form 4 major organic molecules. Now, we've already talked about carbohydrates, so today we're going to talk about lipids. So the 2 targets we're going to use to get there are to understand the role that lipids play in living organisms, such as energy storage, chemical messenger, and the membrane structure, and to understand how phospholipids form a boundary between the inside and outside of a cell. I don't expect you to know what a phospholipid is yet, unless you've done your vocabulary terms for Unit 2B. However, you're going to learn all about that today. So the first target, roles that lipids play in in living organisms such as our cells. Predominantly, the one we think about the most is long-term energy storage. Remember, carbohydrates were a quick fix for energy. You eat some sugar, you get a quick rush, as they say. Lipids get stored in your body as a fat, and that's a long-term energy. They hold a lot more energy than carbohydrates do. There are 2 types, saturated and unsaturated. I'm sure you've heard those terms before. We're going to delve into what those 2 mean. There are phospholipids from, like we said, the cell membrane, and cholesterol. Those are both parts of the cell membrane, and I know, like I said, we're going to dive into all that in Unit 3, but just understand that without phospholipids and cholesterol, cells, life, everything wouldn't exist the way that it does now. There are also things called hormones that run through your system. Those are technically a steroid. They're used to transmit chemical messages. So the final one we're not going to talk a lot about are waxes. Remember, what we need to know about lipids in order to understand them better. We've been talking about carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. With carbohydrates, that's a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, but not with lipids. You have carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, but it's no set ratio. You can have great big long molecules, or much shorter molecules, or some that don't have hardly any at all. Some physical characteristics, when you think about lipids, think greasy, think that they don't dissolve in water, that they're slippery, not like soap, but like oil, okay? And what you need to think about is energy is stored between every carbon-hydrogen bond in everything. And fats have a lot of those carbon-hydrogen bonds. So they store more energy than carbohydrates do. When you think about it in terms of food calories, carbohydrate, if you eat a carbohydrate, you get like 4 calories to do work per gram. But with a fat, you get 9 calories to do work per gram. That's why it's harder to burn off fats than it is to burn off sugars. Unfortunately, the more carbohydrates you eat, if your body eats too many of them, will store them as fats. Likewise, they produce more ATP than carbohydrates. But let's revisit what I just said here for a minute by looking at this cartoon. It says we're over our energy quota again. What should we do with the excess? And the other cell says store it as fat. Well, we've been doing that kind of a lot lately, though shouldn't we stop? And the fat cell's like, no, we might need that for something. So anything you eat, even if it's not a fat, if you eat too much of it, will get stored as a fat, because it's an efficient way to keep those carbon-hydrogen connections. Okay, so, and then this picture illustration I showed you is just showing you this last paragraph here. It's an illustration. When you burn these things, how much energy you get off of each one. We haven't talked about proteins yet. Properties of lipids. They repel water. So if they are not attracted to water or they repel water, that's a phobia. So if you're afraid of something, you avoid it. So think about arachnophobia if you're afraid of spiders. So hydro would be water phobia. Hydrophobia means that those things don't they're not attracted to, they don't like to be around water. They are what we call hydrocarbons because they're combined with hydrogen, hydro and carbons. Okay. Properties of the fats depend upon the carbon bonds in their fatty acids. The way that the carbons are bonded together in the long portion of the molecule will determine the properties of those fats. For example, whether or not it's a solid at room temperature or a liquid at room temperature will be dependent upon how the carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon bonds are formed. Fats in meat are different from fats in oils and from oils and vegetables because the type of the bonds and the length of the carbon chain. So if you look here, all I've got is just a refresher for what a carb molecule looks like. It should look like a polygon shape. A fat molecule or a lipid might have multiple chains on it, but the two predominant factors, portions of it, will be this, what we call, this we call a carboxyl group, a carbon and oxygen and some hydrogens, but the oxygen is on there. It's like an end group. And then look at the backbone of this, carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon, etc. And you make a backbone with as many of those as you wanted, ideally, depending on the size of the organism. So every time you see these carbon bonds, think about energy is being stored. So the structure versus the function, which again, a very recurring theme we have in biology. If you have a solid fat, we often refer to that as a triglyceride. Those are usually found in animals, like animal fats. And the liquid versions, like vegetable oil, for example, if you cook it all, those are from plants. So I've got here a video link, and I really recommend that you follow it. It's going to go into the structure of these animal versus plant, or most of the time saturated versus unsaturated, and what that means. And I'm going to go into it in the next slide, but feel free to follow that video as a reinforcement to this lesson. So, saturated versus unsaturated. I'm sure you've heard those terms. If not, if you've ever gone to the grocery store and looked at the label on your food, you've got to figure out, well, which fats are good fats and which fats are not. So, when we call it a saturated fat, when the bonds between the carbons are only single bonds. So in this, here, let me take this off. Okay, in this illustration here, you see the bond between carbon and carbon. Now we've talked about this before. That means there's 2 electrons shared. All of these bonds you see here between the carbons are single bonds. That means all the electrons, all the parking spaces or the bonding sites for every carbon is filled. There is, for this one carbon, there's 2 bonds to another carbon and 2 bonds to hydrogen. So that is saturated. That means it's just full up with things to bond to. Okay, so this is saturated. It's more common in animal fats. And because of their linear structure, they are more easily stacked upon themselves. So they form a solid better because they can become quite dense. And again, because you have more hydrogens bonded, you have more opportunities for energy storage. That's why lipids are more, not efficient energy, they're just a bigger capacity. All right, unsaturated, the difference between saturated and unsaturated, I'm going to give you a second just to look at it. But the main difference that you should notice is that the unsaturated is going to have one or more double bond. Now remember, if a single bond shares 2 electrons covalently, a double bond would be double that, or 4 electrons. So that means that these 2 carbons, they don't need another, at this point, they don't need another hydrogen off of each of them. So they're only forming 3 bonds, a double and 2 singles. Okay? So because they have this shape that is not as linear, when the temperatures, like at room temperature, they don't form a solid as well. They are predominantly a liquid because they don't stack up as nicely. So those are most common in plants, where double bond is, like I said, there's only one hydrogen per atom of carbon. And these are more easily broken down in your body. All right, and so unsaturated fats are better for you because they don't form solid artery clogging, right? Now at 98 degrees, that's not room temperature, but they do accumulate into plaques. The saturated fats do, and then these are easier to break apart, okay? Because you can add in a hydrogen here to make those happy, and break this into two chains. Right? Maybe you've heard of the term hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated, like partially hydrogenated soybean oil, for example. If you look here, or partially hydrogenated vegetable oil or hydrogenated oils. If you've ever seen anything like that on a label, if you haven't, take a look at your food, because those oils, those fats are the worst for you, because what the company has done before they've packaged it is they've saturated each of those fat molecules. Now, it's going to make it taste better, and it's going to have a more luxurious texture, but it's a lot less healthy because those are harder to break down. Once the carbon is saturated, let's look at that again. Once the carbon is saturated with hydrogens, there's really no motivation to break it apart. There's no motivation to bond anywhere else to make this a smaller molecule because everybody's happy. Whereas if you have an unsaturated fat, there's an opportunity to break that down. So you would like, ideally, to eat polyunsaturated fats, more than one double bond. In the body, one of the most important functions or roles of lipids is in the cell membrane. So if you look at your cell membranes when we get to Unit 3, you're going to notice that there's a barrier between the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell. Well, except for plants, they also have a cell wall. So this is what the barrier looks like on a large scale. This is an individual lipid, or a phospholipid in this case, because they've taken the lipids, these tails, and they've added on a phosphate group head. So a phospholipid has phosphorus in it as well. And what you need to understand about those is that the head, the phosphate group at the head, this large structure here, is attracted to water. It is polar. Do you see the little charge on the oxygen there? And the little, these are like non-polar. So this has a little bit of an attraction because it's a little bit slightly negative. Okay, so that's going to be attracted to water. These tails are not. Okay, so we've talked about polar heads and non-polar tails. You should know what those two words mean at this point. Here's a cute little illustration to show you how confused water gets when it's around a phospholipid. We're not going to go into the purpose of the membrane of the cell until Unit 3. You just need to understand that that's where you'll find lipids, and they're very important to us. So just to recap here, hydrophilic, water-loving; hydrophobic, water-fearing. I'm going to hammer this home as much as we need to. Here it is again. So just recognize, I guess, from this picture, we call it a bilayer, because it's not just one layer of phospholipids, but two, so that the space inside and outside of the cell, the polar heads of the phospholipids are attracted to arranged themselves toward the watery exterior and the watery interior. What else do we have to cover? I'm going to let you just fill in your notes here, so pause the video. There's nothing really else to talk about. Cholesterol is not always the bad guy. Cholesterol, as well as phospholipids, play an important role in the cell. So they're these little red guys you see tucked in here, and they have important roles, which we'll talk about when we talk about bringing things across the cells. So if cells need to breathe, cells need to eat, etc., and cholesterols are an important part of that. And then finally, hormones, right? So hormones are basically puberty's most valuable players. There are other kinds of hormones, okay? There are protein hormones, and there are peptide and amine hormones, but we're just looking at these ones here, the steroid hormones. So your testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, all of the ones that make us happily go through puberty. Okay, so time to recap. Make sure you're comfortable with those 2 targets to get us to the big idea, and come to class ready to review. Have a great day. We'll talk about proteins next.